Whenever I don't know what to draw, I go to the notes app on my phone, have a list of things that make me happy that I add to all of the time. Otherwise, I kind of go on Pinterest and I end up just scrolling for a few hours and drawing nothing. So this week, the list has dictated that we are drawing a mouse and I am so excited. The reason a mouse is on there in the first place is because I'm currently in the middle of knitting my first ever mouse. She's so cute, I love her so much, but at the moment she does kind of look more like the chicken who crossed the road than Angelina Ballerina. But I'm going to trust the process, and as soon as she looks alive I will post that. But in the meantime, we're going to draw a mouse. Last week in my sketchbook I drew a shrew with a little hat, and so when it came to drawing a mouse, obviously mouse with a little hat, and that's how we got to this guy. I drew him on Monday. I was quite sick so I didn't record any of the process, but I loved him so much. I had to give him his own little garden, and sometimes when I finish an illustration it's not enough. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It's just not enough. I can't get it out of my head. And so this week we are going to draw his backstory. Basically in my head, this little guy is obsessed with Over the Garden Wall, hence his style of pointy hat. And he goes to his granddad and he's trying to explain the concept of Over the Garden Wall, and his granddad doesn't really get it. But what his granddad does understand is gardens. So one night his granddad sits him down in their cosy little nook in a tree, and he cracks open a gardening book and he explains to the little mouse the process of planting the seeds and how you get this like giant magical plant or flower. And for the first time in this little mouse life, he doesn't dream of what's over the garden wall. He starts to get really excited about his own little garden. So that's the scene we are going to draw today. I'm going to talk about my process throughout the video, the techniques I use, how I organise my layers. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you really enjoy the process. I'm so excited. If you've seen any of my sketchbook videos, you'll know that this is the exact same way I start my traditional drawing processes. Sometimes you just don't need to overcomplicate it. You can just take those same techniques and use them for digital art. So I'm doing an initial sketch in the colour blue first. I'm working on a Procreate A4 size canvas, and I've set it to 300 dpi, which I think is just a nice safety net to know that it's going to look really good whether you print it out or it's on screen. I am, however, working in a 3GB colour space because I find it better to do that initially and then later convert it to CMYK in Photoshop if I need to, rather than working directly in CMYK in Procreate. I've already done my initial sketch, the little mouse and the granddad sitting on the armchair, but I just need to clean up some of the lines so that it can create a cleaner guide for the colour that I'm going to do in the next stage. I'm using the dry ink brush in blue for my sketch. It's probably my most used brush. I really enjoy the texture of it, and it's kind of a little bit like drawing in a really soft pencil. I use it loads throughout this process, and a lot of my illustrations are used with just this one brush alone. I used 2 more, maybe 3 more brushes throughout this illustration in total, but all of them are brushes that come already downloaded in Procreate. Once the initial sketch is done, I add a new layer on top of that and start the colour study. I usually do about 3 or 4 of these per illustration just to help decide on a colour palette. I'm going to use a solid ink pen rather than a texture pen for this though, because it just makes it easier to colour drop. And then I'm going to outline all of the major areas and shapes to get an overall idea of how the colours are looking together, whether they're kind of sitting well next to each other, and where your attention is being drawn to when you look at the piece overall. I want this piece to feel like really nostalgic and cozy, and because it's a granddad and grandson, I pulled references from the 1970s colour palette. I think it fits really well because they're quite earthy, and so it ties in with the garden theme. Once my colours are blocked in and I'm happy with how they're looking, I just squish them all onto one layer and pop it in the corner to use as a reference. You don't have to stick to it completely, and I do make some changes as I go, but it's just nice to have like that overall guide and to not have to be making decisions all the time while you work. I know organising your layers can feel like such a faff, but it really does help, so I'm just going to name each of those layers and put them in their own little group so I can find them later on, and then I'm going to make a start on the background and the outer tree. I've turned on drawing assist just to make my life so much easier, and so both sides of the tree are symmetrical, and I'm using a textured brush and colour drop to fill this area in. But sometimes when you use a textured brush it can leave kind of a outline on the edge, so I'm just colouring over that, and then I'm playing around with 2 layers on top in the same colour but set to screen to create a kind of texture effect. I'm setting both of those layers to clip and mask so that they only colour on the tree area, and then I'm doing the same thing again except for multiply, and I'm using a dry brush that we used for the initial sketch to just add a kind of like nice star pattern. Now when I went to add the floor I realised I wasn't liking the colours and they were a little bit too reddy, so I changed them both to orange and I feel like it works so much better. Now that the board is complete, the plan is to make a start on the background elements. I'm going to start with the fire and just block in the main colours first, obviously not forgetting to properly name my layers, and then I'm going to add the flames in, and once the colours are all down I'm going to add texture. I'm using the same texture brush that I used on the outer tree, and I've got my layer set to clip and mask and screen, and I'm just adding it to the very bottom of the flame to give it a kind of glowing effect. I think it was really successful. I'm so happy with how that turned out. Next I'm going to move on to the armchair, and I'm using the solid ink brush to do this just because I want to make it as clean as possible when I drop the colour into it. And finally the rug. Now I'm moving on to the mushroom, and I'm going to repeat the same star pattern onto the mushroom. A lot of the time with this illustration I'm just repeating the same steps over and over again but on different elements so that when it all comes together it looks like really cohesive. I've got it set to screen and I'm using the dry brush again for the little stars and the little circles. And then I'm just adding the same texture to the armchair so it looks kind of fabric-y. Back to the mushroom, I'm using the dry brush with it just set to multiply to add those little stripes. And then finally I'm adding like a kind of shadow onto the bottom edge. And now the background's done, we can move on to the main part of the illustration. I'm going to start with the book just because that's in the front of the 2 mice, and I'm just going to roughly block in the shape. I'm using the dry brush, the dry ink brush for this rather than the solid ink brush because I want it to have a little bit of texture because it's made of paper. I'm just going in and altering that colour so that it stands out a little bit more against the background, and then it's time to block in the shapes of the heads. I'm adding the little mouse's head on a different layer to the granddad's head because it makes it easier later when I'm adding shadows to the little mouse's head that I don't want on the granddad. I'm so sorry by the way if the way I hold my pen annoys anybody. It really hurts my joints to hold it properly, so I hold it in like a million different ways during this video. Now that I've got the main colour of the fur, I'm going in and adding the ears and the cheeks. I use the solid ink brush for the ears because I want them to have quite a clear cut line, but then for the cheeks I'm using the dry ink brush because I want them to have a little bit more texture. I love adding rosy cheeks to anything. I don't think I've ever completed an illustration without adding rosy cheeks. Now I'm going to block in the clothes for the little mouse. This is the second illustration of a two-piece set, so I'm copying his original costume into this one. I'm adding his little feet and his little hands. And then I'm adding a multiply layer over the top of that, reducing the opacity a little bit and adding some shadows. And the same for his skin. And then finally, some stripes for his trousers. I'm going to do the same now with the grandad. You can see I've drawn a little bit over the book where I didn't want to, and so I fixed that by selecting the layer that's on the book and then going back to the jumper, and it lets me rub out just the bit that touches the book. I think it's a really cool trick and it saves me so much time. I'm going to do the same thing now, but with the jumper, where I've gone over his sleeve a little bit on the hand that I didn't want to. I just select the layer, go back to the layer I want to erase, and it just stops me from erasing anything I don't want to erase. Now to his trousers, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before with the multiply layer and add some shadows. And then finally the same texture that we added earlier onto the sofa and the tree. I think it gives a really cool like corduroy look to his trousers. I really like it. And then obviously the little mouse didn't get his patterned trousers wearing from nowhere, so his granddad has to have some fun ones too. And then I'm just adding some highlights onto the top of his jumper and the rib to make it look kind of knitted. Some final texture to both of their faces, and then it's finally time to add their facial features. I've got the initial sketch I did in the corner as a reference, just so I know how everything is supposed to look, and then I'm using the same trick before of selecting a different layer so that I can add the mouth to the grandad without drawing outside of the lines. Adding his glasses, and then some whiskers. I'm using the multiply layer to add some shadows to the granddad's face, and then under his glasses as well. His hands where his jumper should be, and then I did forget to add the nose before onto the little mouse, so I'm adding those back in. And then finally I'm adding a screen layer and the dry ink brush to give it a kind of fur-like texture. This looks like it only took 5 seconds. This took me 8 minutes. My hand was so sore at the end of it. And then finally I'm adding his socks. I'm just duplicating this layer instead of drawing them twice to save myself some time, but I'm adding the extra bit of ankle that's peeping through. And then I'm going to put them both on the same layer so that it makes it easier now when I'm adding clipping masks on top. I'm adding some texture first and then going through with a multiply layer to add the heel and the toes of his socks, and then using a screen layer to add the stitching detail on top. And finally some shadows from where his trousers sit above. Then I'm going to go back to the book and add some of the details that we didn't add before. I'm adding shadows first from where the hands are sitting. And then I'm going to add the blurb on the back. I'm using the same colour that I used for the fire to tie it together. And then I'm drawing a little leaf on the front and writing the title in the same green of the armchair. The same pattern that we just used on the socks for the stitching, I'm going to use on the side of the book. I added some texture and then realised I did not like that leaf, so got rid of that, drew a new leaf. So much better. And now that most of the main details are done, I'm going to go back to the original background elements and add some more texture over there. I'm starting with adding shadows to the footrest and then going into the details on the armchair. I want these little circles to look like buttons, so I'm just erasing 4 little dots in the middle, and then I'm just cleaning up that line work that I've just done because I made an absolute mess of it. I'm going to take down the opacity and then add the shadows from where the mice are sitting. I'm going to go back onto the Grandad mouse and just erase part of his ear using a textured brush so that it looks as though he's sitting kind of behind the armchair, and add a shadow for that detail too. And then the same thing with the shadows but onto the rug and the floor and the wall behind them. I'm going to go back to the brush that we used for the fire, and I'm going to add a kind of glow onto the armchair. I'm going in to the layer adjuster and selecting bloom so that it kind of gives a glowing effect, and then I'm using Gaussian blur to soften it up a little bit. I'm going back in with a multiplier layer and the texture brush, and I'm going to darken the other side of the chair just to really bring that difference to life. And then finally I'm going to add some fairy lights. I'm using the same texture brush that we've used all along, except really small this time, to add the little lights. And I'm going to add a multiply layer into the centre to give it the same kind of blooming effect that we used on the flame, but in the opposite way. Now for the details on the wall, I'm just adding kind of a wood grain effect, and repeating that process on the floor as well. And then the same pattern but on the outer tree. I'm doing this on a screen layer and just adjusting the opacity down so it's a bit less in your face and kind of more subtle. And then for the rug, I didn't know what to do for the texture of the rug, and I'm actually using a brush I haven't used for the rest of the illustration to give it a kind of watercolour effect. I think it worked really well. Finally, I'm adding a multiply layer to give it a kind of shadowed effect into the centre of the hollow. And I've taken away the fairy lights. I wasn't sure if I like them or not. I might put them back. And then I'm done. Oh, I'm so happy with it. Thank you so much for creating this with me. It honestly feels so good to get that out of my head. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing, and I will see you next week for whatever the list decides we're going to draw then.